Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video Aided Instructions English Grammar Series. This is the program on punctuation. Punctuation marks are those little signs and symbols like periods, commas, semicolons, colons, and many others that are added to sentences to help make them easier to read. Think of punctuation marks as being like traffic signs that you see when you're driving. They tell you when to slow down, when to change direction, and when to come to a complete stop. If you learn how to use punctuation marks correctly in the sentences you write, no one will get lost while reading your work. If you're ready, let's begin with our study of punctuation marks and how to use them. As you recall, there are 4 different kinds of sentences: declarative, interrogative, imperative, and exclamatory. Let's look at each of these 4 kinds of sentences and look at the kind of punctuation mark you need to use to end each type of sentence. First, use a period to punctuate the end of a declarative sentence. As you recall, a declarative sentence states a fact. The great majority of sentences in usual written English are declarative sentences, so most of the sentences you write will end with periods. Here are a couple of examples. It's raining outside. She is my sister. Both of these are declarative sentences. They state facts, and appropriately each one ends with a period, a simple dot. Most sentences you write will be declarative sentences and will end with periods. Next, use a question mark to punctuate the end of an interrogative sentence. An interrogative sentence asks a question. Appropriately enough, it's marked at the end with a question mark. Here are a couple of examples. Would you like some coffee? What time is the party? Both of these sentences are interrogative sentences. They ask questions. And notice that they are read slightly differently. Your voice turns upward a little bit at the end of an interrogative sentence. Putting a question mark at the end of the sentence makes it very clear to the reader that this is an interrogative sentence, one that asks a question, and that needs to be read in that special tone of voice. Notice that you don't use a question mark to punctuate the end of an indirect question. What is an indirect question? This is a sentence which refers to or describes a question, but which itself does not ask a question. Therefore, an indirect question is really a declarative sentence, even though at first glance you might think that it is an interrogative sentence. Take a look at this example. Juan asked Maria whether she would like some coffee. Now, this sentence refers to or describes a question. Juan is asking Maria a question. Would you like some coffee? But notice that the sentence itself doesn't ask the question. Instead, the sentence is really describing the question or making a statement. It is stating a fact that Juan has asked Maria a question. Therefore, the sentence itself is not an interrogative sentence. It isn't asking a question. So it doesn't end with a question mark. Instead, it ends with a period. This is an example of what we call an indirect question. Here's another example. I wonder what time the party will start. Now, the same general idea might have been stated in the form of an interrogative sentence. For example, this sentence might have been written, what time will the party start? That would have been an interrogative sentence, a question, and it would have ended appropriately with a question mark. However, the way the sentence was worded, it is a declarative sentence. It is making a statement of fact. That is, I am wondering something. It is stating that as a fact rather than asking a question. And therefore, this too is an indirect question and one that does not end with a question mark, but rather with a period. Now, the third type of sentence. Use a period or an exclamation point to punctuate the end of an imperative sentence. An imperative sentence expresses a request or a command. When you're asking or ordering someone to do something, you are writing an imperative sentence. And an imperative sentence may end with a period or an exclamation point. It all depends on the nature of the request or the command. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Hand me that hammer, please. This is an imperative sentence because whoever has written or is speaking the sentence is expressing a request, asking someone else to do something. Since it's written in a quiet tone of voice and does not have a great deal of urgency or strong emotion built into it, it's appropriate to end it with a period. Most imperative sentences which express requests or commands will end with periods. Occasionally, however, a request or command will be uttered with a great deal of urgency or emotion, in which case an exclamation point may be the appropriate punctuation mark to use at the end of the sentence. Look at this example. Get out, quick! This might be spoken by a firefighter arriving at the scene of a fire, warning the people in the house to get out right away. This is a command that's being spoken with a great deal of urgency and emotion and a great deal of emphasis. For all these reasons, ending the sentence with an exclamation point is appropriate. The exclamation point is used in English to indicate that a sentence is being written or spoken with a great deal of feeling. You only want to use exclamation points where they're really appropriate. Certain types of commands do require exclamation points, although as we've seen, most do not. So an imperative sentence may end either with a period or an exclamation point, depending on the degree of urgency and emotion that's built into the sentence. You'll have to be the judge. Finally, use an exclamation point to punctuate the end of an exclamatory sentence. An exclamatory sentence is defined as one that expresses strong emotion or strong feeling. Therefore, by definition, it's appropriate to end an exclamatory sentence with an exclamation point. That tells the reader, this sentence has just expressed something that is very important with a great sense of urgency attached to it, and therefore you need to pay close attention to what it says. When you end a sentence with an exclamation point, you're telling the reader, pay attention. Here are a couple of examples of exclamatory sentences. The house is on fire. There's a message that, of course, contains a great deal of emotion and urgency, and it's appropriate to end it with an exclamation point. That's an exclamatory sentence. Here's another example. What a beautiful sunset. Now, here's a message that's much more positive. Rather than talking about physical danger, the person who speaks or writes this sentence is simply reflecting on the beauty of nature. However, because strong emotion is involved, an exclamation point seems appropriate. This, too, is an exclamatory sentence. So as we've seen, each of the four types of English sentences needs to be punctuated in a slightly different way. Most sentences are declarative sentences, and they will end with periods. But interrogative sentences need question marks. Imperative sentences may use either periods or exclamation points, depending on whether strong emotion is involved, and an exclamatory sentence ends with an exclamation point. In your study guide, we've provided an exercise which will enable you to practice using punctuation marks to end sentences correctly. In this exercise, we provided several sentences without end punctuation. Your job is to read each sentence, decide what type of sentence it is, and therefore what type of end punctuation is needed. Let's look at the first example. Where can I buy a portable radio similar to the one you brought to the ball game yesterday? Now, what type of sentence is this? Perhaps you can tell just from the words used that the person who wrote or is speaking this sentence is expressing a question. Therefore, this is an interrogative sentence and ought to end with a question mark. And therefore, it ought to be read in a particular way with that rising inflection at the end, which indicates that this is a question. And the question mark would make it obvious that that's what we're reading. Where can I buy a portable radio similar to the one you brought to the ball game yesterday? Question mark. Next example. After giving me reliable service for 8 years, my car finally broke down last week. Now, what is this sentence doing? Is it expressing a question, like the interrogative sentence we just looked at? No, not really. Instead, it's simply stating a fact. Therefore, this is a declarative sentence and ought to end with a period. As we've said, most sentences that you write will be declarative sentences and will end with periods. Now, perhaps you were tempted to say this is an exclamatory sentence because it expresses a strong emotion, but that's not really appropriate. It's possible that the person who writes or speaks this sentence does have a strong emotion about the fact that the car broke down, but the sentence itself doesn't really speak about that strong emotion. It simply says that the car did break down. And remember, exclamatory sentences should be used rather rarely in your writing. Don't lean toward using a lot of exclamatory sentences. In most cases, treating a sentence as a simple declarative sentence and putting a period at the end is most appropriate, and that would be the correct answer for this question. Next, that's an incredible story. Now here we have a true exclamatory sentence. The person who speaks or writes this sentence is expressing a strong emotion. He or she is saying that the story that has just been told is one that's amazing, incredible, hard to believe, breathtaking. All of those are expressions of strong feeling. And therefore, it would be appropriate to treat this as an exclamatory sentence and end it with an exclamation point. And the sentence, if it were being read aloud, would probably be read in such a way as to convey that strong emotion. That's an incredible story. That's the way you read an exclamatory sentence, and the exclamation point is appropriate. Next example. I'd like to know why the senator voted against the appropriation bill. Now, what is this sentence doing? Is it expressing strong emotion? No, not really. Very mild emotion. Is it asking a question? Well, not really. You might be tempted to think of this as an interrogative sentence because the person who speaks or writes this sentence does have a question in mind. But notice that the question is being stated indirectly, not directly. For this to be an interrogative sentence, it would have to read something like, why did the senator vote against the appropriation bill? Then the sentence would be directly expressing a question. Instead, this is a declarative sentence because it only states the question indirectly. It states as a fact that I am wondering about something or I would like to know something. It is stating that as a fact rather than expressing the question directly. And remember, an indirect question is really a declarative sentence and should be ended with a period rather than a question mark. Next example. Let me have a copy of the paper you wrote for our art history class. What kind of sentence is this? Well, this is an example of an imperative sentence because it's expressing a request or a command. In this case, I think we'd call it a request. It's expressed politely and in a quiet tone of voice. There's certainly not a great deal of urgency or emotion in the request. It's not like the order that the firefighter gives to get out of the house quick. Instead, this is a quiet, unemotional request, and therefore we would treat it appropriately with a period rather than an exclamation point. Remember that an imperative sentence may end with either one, depending on how strong the sense of urgency or emotion is. In this case, a period makes sense. If a period, a question mark, and an exclamation point are like stop signs, you might think of commas as being like yield signs. They tell the reader not to come to a complete stop, but rather to slow down or pause. Now, some writers who aren't sure about how to use commas correctly tend to sprinkle commas into their sentences almost at random, just to kind of slow down the reader from place to place. That's not the best way to use commas. Instead, the right way to use commas is to put them in where they are required by certain specific rules, which have to do with pauses or breaks in the meaning of the sentence. In this lesson, we'll look at the rules that lay out the most important places where commas ought to be used, so that you'll be able to use commas more correctly in the sentences you write. First, use a comma to set off a modifying phrase or clause at the start of a sentence. Now, you might remember from other programs in this series that sometimes phrases or clauses, groups of words, can be used as modifiers. That is, they give more information about something else in the sentence. These modifying phrases and clauses almost act like adjectives and adverbs. They give more information about a specific other word that appears in the sentence. Now, when a modifying phrase or clause appears at the start of a sentence, you usually want to use a comma to set it off, to separate it from the rest of the sentence. That makes the sentence a little bit easier to understand, and it puts a pause into the sentence in a place that feels appropriate. Here are a couple of examples. Lost in thought, Peter didn't hear Andre's question. Now let's look at the phrase that begins this sentence, lost in thought. What role does this phrase have in the sentence? Well, it acts as a modifier. It gives further information about Peter. It describes or tells something about Peter. Therefore, this is a phrase that's acting almost like an adjective because it's giving more information about a noun that appears elsewhere in the sentence. Because this is a modifying phrase that appears at the start of the sentence, it makes sense to separate it from the rest of the sentence by using a comma. And notice that the pause makes the sentence a little easier to understand, and it seems to fit logically with the meaning of the sentence. Lost in thought, Peter didn't hear Andre's question. Notice that the pause in reading that sentence makes it a little easier to understand and a little clearer, and that's why the comma works in that location. Another example. When I arrived at the beach, the tide was coming in. Here the sentence begins with a clause which acts as a modifier. The entire dependent or subordinate clause, when I arrived at the beach, tells more information about something else that appears in the sentence. The tide was coming in when? When I arrived at the beach. Therefore, that entire clause is acting as a modifier, almost like an adverb, because it gives more information about the verb was coming later in the sentence. The entire clause, then, is a modifying clause, and it ought to be separated from the rest of the sentence by a comma. And that's why we've put in the comma after the word beach. Notice again that the pause after that modifying clause makes the sentence a little easier to understand. When I arrived at the beach, the tide was coming in. The pause seems to make sense, and it makes the sentence a little bit clearer and easier to understand. In this case, we have a modifying clause that begins the sentence, and therefore it's appropriate to separate it by using a comma. Here's another rule about when to use a comma. Use a pair of commas to set off a word or phrase that interrupts the meaning of a sentence. Sometimes you'll write a sentence which has a main train of thought, but there's an additional fact or idea that you want to insert somewhere into the sentence because it's interesting and important, but not necessarily essential to the meaning of the sentence. We consider this group of words an interrupter, something that breaks into the main flow of the sentence. When you put in a group of words like this into a sentence which interrupts the main flow, set it off with commas, a pair of commas, one on either side. That signals to the reader, whoops, here's a little detour, don't get sidetracked, and it makes it easier for the reader to follow the complete meaning of the sentence. Here's an example. Harry Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, was born in Missouri. Now we have a group of words in the middle of the sentence here, the 33rd President of the United States. That tells a little bit more about Harry Truman. It's an interesting and important fact. But notice that it interrupts the main flow of the sentence. We can tell this because if we eliminate those words altogether, what is left still makes sense and still has the same meaning. Harry Truman was born in Missouri. We understand exactly what's being said. This person, this man named Harry Truman, was born in Missouri. Those words that are added in the middle give a little more information and help to define a bit more about who Harry Truman was, but they're not strictly necessary, and they do interrupt the main flow of the sentence. Therefore, it's appropriate to set them off with commas, to have a comma before and a comma after that group of words. And again, notice that inserting the pauses when we read the sentence makes the sentence a little easier to understand. Harry Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, was born in Missouri. Notice how the link between the subject of the sentence, Harry Truman, and the verb was becomes a little clearer when we pause to set off those words that interrupt the flow from the subject to the verb. So this is a classic example of a sentence that contains an interrupting phrase. It's good to set that off from the rest of the sentence with a pair of commas. One more example. My uncle, unlike his three brothers, never learned to drive a car. When we eliminate the words unlike his three brothers, the sentence still means the same thing and still makes sense. My uncle never learned to drive a car. Those interrupting words, unlike his three brothers, give a little more information and add an interesting fact, but they're not strictly necessary. So we consider that an interrupting group of words which ought to be set off by a comma at the beginning and a comma at the end. Don't forget that when an interrupting phrase or clause like this appears in the middle of a sentence, it needs to be set off by a pair of commas. Don't forget to put a comma at the beginning and at the end. Sometimes people make the mistake of putting a comma in one place, not the other. That's unclear. To make it clear to the reader that this is a phrase or clause that interrupts the rest of the sentence, you need to set off the entire thing with a pair of commas. Now here's a subtle variation which is important to note. Don't use commas to set off a word or phrase which is essential to understanding the meaning of the sentence. Sometimes a sentence contains a word, a phrase, a group of words which may at first glance appear to be an interrupter. But if you look closely, you realize that the word or phrase is actually essential to understanding what the sentence is saying. When that's the case, don't set it off with commas, because those words are not simply interrupting the flow of the sentence. They're an integral, important part of the flow of the sentence. So understanding the meaning of what's being said and recognizing what's essential and not essential for the meaning is actually very necessary to punctuate the sentence correctly. Let's look at this example. The historian Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a famous book about Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, the sentence is saying that Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote this famous book, but it begins with the words, the historian, and you might then think that her name, Doris Kearns Goodwin, is a kind of interrupter. If you take away the interrupter, the sentence does still make a kind of sense. The historian wrote a famous book about Franklin D. Roosevelt. But think about what that's saying. Can we tell which historian is being talked about if we leave out the words Doris Kearns Goodwin? We really can't. Now the sentence is saying the historian wrote a famous book, but we don't know which historian, so we don't really understand what the sentence is saying. It's essential for us to understand the sentence to have those words Doris Kearns Goodwin in there. And therefore, we can't regard those words as a mere interruption. They are essential to the basic meaning of the sentence. We've got to leave them in there, and therefore, we shouldn't surround them with commas. When you put a pair of commas around words or a phrase in a sentence, you're implying that those words can be ignored to a degree without changing the meaning of the sentence. That wouldn't be the case here, and therefore you don't put commas around Doris Kearns Goodwin. One more example. My Uncle Jerry is an expert driver. Once again, the name Jerry might appear at first glance to be an interrupter. But if we put commas around it, what's left outside of the commas would be, my uncle is an expert driver. And once again, we can't be sure who exactly is being spoken about. I might have several uncles, and therefore to simply say my uncle is an expert driver might leave the meaning of the sentence somewhat unclear. Since the name Jerry is essential to the meaning of the sentence, it's better not to put commas around it and instead let the sentence read as one unit. So before you put a pair of commas around an interrupting word or phrase, make sure it really does interrupt and is not essential to the meaning of the sentence. That makes an important difference to the right way to punctuate the sentence. Our next comma rule. Use a comma to separate two independent clauses that are linked with a coordinating conjunction. Now, you'll recall that independent clauses are clauses which contain both a subject and a verb and can stand alone as a sentence. An independent clause could appear as a sentence all by itself, but sometimes we do link independent clauses in larger sentences. One way of linking two independent clauses to create a larger sentence is by using a coordinating conjunction. There are 6 coordinating conjunctions: and, or, nor, for, but, and yet. Whenever you have a sentence containing 2 independent clauses joined by one of these coordinating conjunctions, it's good practice to insert a comma between the 2 clauses to separate them clearly. It puts in a pause where it's appropriate and makes the sentence a little bit easier to follow. Here's an example. French wines are considered the finest in the world, but many other countries also produce excellent wine. Here we have a sentence that is made up of two independent clauses. Each of the clauses here could stand alone as a sentence. French wines are considered the finest in the world. Yes, that could be a sentence by itself. Many other countries also produce excellent wine. That too could be a sentence by itself. Because the two ideas are closely linked, the author has decided to join them into a single sentence and use the coordinating conjunction but as the connector. And that makes perfect sense. Notice that a comma is necessary before the conjunction but. It puts a pause between the two independent clauses, which separates them. It makes it a little easier to follow the logic of the sentence, and it warns the reader, slow down a bit because we're about to change course, just like a yield sign on a highway. So when we pause slightly in reading that sentence, it's a little easier to understand, and the pause makes sense with the shift in meaning that's about to begin. So when you have two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction, use a comma as well. Here's an exception to the rule. Omit the comma if both independent clauses are very short. In some cases, you might write a sentence that contains two or even more independent clauses that are all very short and joined with coordinating conjunction. If that's the case, you can usually omit the comma because the effect works perfectly well to read straight through when the clauses are very short. Here's a simple example. I hear and I obey. Here we have two independent clauses. I hear, I obey. And they're joined by the coordinating conjunction and. You could put a comma before the conjunction and if you want, but because the clauses are so short and the sentence is so quick and easy to read and understand, it doesn't really seem to be necessary. So this is an exception to the rule. You can omit the comma if both clauses are very short. Here's our last rule for using commas. Use commas to separate items in a list. When you're listing three or more items in a sentence, it makes the list much easier to read and understand if you separate the items with commas. Here's an example. The exhibit of Spanish art included paintings by Velázquez, Murillo, and Goya. This sentence contains a list of three Spanish painters whose work was included in the exhibit: Velázquez, Murillo, and Goya. To make the sentence easier to read, the author has inserted commas after Velázquez and Murillo. The comma that appears before the word and in this particular sentence has a special name. It's called the serial comma. And you actually have a choice as to whether to insert that one or not. Normally, when you create a list like this, you will have the word and before the last item in the list. And inserting the comma before the word and is actually optional. Some writers prefer to use it. Some writers prefer to omit it. Personally, I like to use it. I think it adds just a little bit of clarity to the sentence, but you wouldn't be wrong if you omitted it. However, the comma after Velázquez earlier in the list is absolutely essential. So use commas to separate items in a list. The final comma, the serial comma, may or may not be inserted. That's your choice. Here's a slightly different kind of list that also requires commas. Miriam drove up in a small, battered, rusty station wagon. Here we have a sentence that strings together a list of several adjectives, all describing the noun station wagon. What kind of station wagon was it? It was a small one, and a battered one, and a rusty one. So here we have three adjectives in a row, all added to describe a particular noun. Again, it's much clearer if you insert commas between the adjectives. So we have a comma after small and a comma after battered. Notice that you don't insert a comma after the last adjective. The last adjective here is rusty. Station wagon we consider one noun, even though it's made up of two words. Don't think that in this case the noun is wagon and station is another adjective. That's really not the case, because she didn't drive up in a wagon after all. It wasn't a particular type of wagon. It was a type of car that is known by one name, station wagon. So the noun here is station wagon, and the last adjective that precedes the noun station wagon is rusty. And you wouldn't put a comma separating that adjective from the noun station wagon. But you do have commas separating the other adjectives. So small comma, battered comma, rusty station wagon would be the right way to string together the adjectives here. So once again, we have a kind of a list. In this case, it's a list or a series of adjectives. And to make the sentence clearer and easier to read, insert commas after each of the adjectives except for the last one. There are some other instances in which commas might be used in sentences, but the rules we've just given you will cover the vast majority of appropriate places to use commas in your sentences. Turn to your study guide and try your hand at the exercise, which tests your understanding of these rules. When you're finished, come back and we'll look at those sentences together. In this exercise, you were given several sentences, some of which contain commas and some of which do not. Some of the commas are correct, some aren't, and in some cases, commas need to be inserted. Let's look at each sentence and figure out the right way to use commas in each one. First, the exhibit includes fossil remains of Apatosaurus, Stegosaurus, Tyrannosaurus, and several other dinosaurs. Here we have a sentence that contains a list. It lists several dinosaurs whose fossils appear in the exhibit. Remember that when you are giving items in a list, you need to separate them using commas. And I think you can see that the sentence will be clearer and easier to understand when those commas are inserted. So the sentence should correctly be punctuated this way. The exhibit includes fossil remains of Apatosaurus, comma, Stegosaurus, comma, Tyrannosaurus, comma, and several other dinosaurs. Now, of course, that last comma is the serial comma, the one that appears after the name Tyrannosaurus. So it's really optional. You could include it or not as you prefer. I recommend using it, but it's up to you, and you wouldn't be incorrect if you left it out. Next example. Having been born in Nigeria, Henry, comma, never saw snow until he visited Colorado last winter. Well, there is a comma in this sentence, and we need to ask whether the comma is appropriate. We also need to ask whether there should be a comma somewhere else in the sentence. As it happens, this sentence should contain one comma, but the comma that it contains is actually in the wrong place. Let's take a look at the sentence more closely. Notice the opening words of the sentence. Having been born in Nigeria. What role do those words play in the sentence? What do they describe, or who do they give information about? Well, what those words do is modify the noun that follows, Henry. Those words act as a kind of an adjective, giving us more information about Henry. And since the sentence begins with a modifying phrase, we want to set off that phrase from the rest of the sentence with a comma. So there really should be a comma after the word Nigeria here. That would make it clear that the opening phrase is a modifying phrase, which should be separated from the rest of the sentence by a comma. Now, what about the comma that appears in the sentence after the name Henry? Is that appropriate or not? Well, it really doesn't fit any of the rules that we've seen in this lesson. There's no good reason to put a comma there, and in fact, it's better to not have a comma in a location like this. Notice that the comma in this case would help to separate the subject of the sentence, Henry, from the verb saw. And it's usually a bad idea to separate the subject and verb of a sentence unless it's necessary. Sometimes you will have an interrupting phrase between a subject and a verb in a sentence, in which case a pair of commas to set off the interrupting phrase is a good idea. But when that's not the case, it's better not to separate the subject and a verb in a sentence, and therefore the comma here really should be omitted. When we read the sentence with a pause in the correct place where the comma really belongs after the word Nigeria, we can see that the meaning holds together very clearly. Having been born in Nigeria, Henry never saw snow until he visited Colorado last winter. Now the sentence makes sense, and the ideas that belong together have been grouped appropriately. Next example. Felipe enjoys rebuilding the engines of classic cars, and he was happy when Simone asked him to work on her 1969 Corvette. Here we have two independent clauses joined by the coordinating conjunction and. That should be a signal to you that a comma is needed. In the normal course of events, when you have a sentence consisting of two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction, you want to separate them with a comma before the conjunction. So the sentence ought to be properly punctuated this way. Felipe enjoys rebuilding the engines of classic cars, comma, and he was happy when Simone asked him to work on her 1969 Corvette. Notice again that the pause actually makes the sentence a little easier to read and a little clearer. So adding the comma helps the reader as well. Another example. Lake Placid, a ski resort in upstate New York, was the site of the 1980 Winter Olympics. And here we do have a comma after the words New York. Now, is that correct? Does the sentence need any other commas? Should this comma be omitted? Let's think about it. In this case, we have an interrupting phrase, a group of words that breaks into the main flow of the sentence. Notice that if we took out the words a ski resort in upstate New York and eliminated them from the sentence, the rest of the sentence would still be clear and would have the same meaning. Lake Placid was the site of the 1980 Winter Olympics. That's basically what the sentence is saying. The interrupting phrase gives a little further information about Lake Placid, a ski resort in upstate New York. Tells us more about Lake Placid, but it isn't strictly necessary. Therefore, it should be set off by commas on both ends. So the mistake that the writer of this sentence made was to put a comma at the end of the interrupting phrase, but not one at the beginning. It's a common mistake. There should be a comma in both places, and so the sentence should correctly read, Lake Placid, comma, a ski resort in upstate New York, comma, was the site of the 1980 Winter Olympics. Now, the author has clearly set aside that interrupting phrase by bracketing it with a pair of commas, and that makes the flow of the sentence a lot clearer. One more example. We spotted the actor, comma, Tom Hanks, comma, having lunch in a restaurant on Madison Avenue. Now here again, we have some words that serve to give more information about or explain some other words that are nearby. I'm talking about the words Tom Hanks. Now, those words in this sentence have been set apart by commas, as if Tom Hanks is an interrupting phrase. Is that correct? Remember our rule. If you eliminate the interrupting phrase, the sentence should still mean the same thing. Is that the case if we eliminate the words Tom Hanks? Does the sentence still say exactly the same thing? We spotted the actor having lunch in a restaurant on Madison Avenue. Suddenly, the meaning of the sentence is unclear. We don't really know what actor is being described. The sentence suddenly does not have the same meaning. We can see then that the words Tom Hanks are actually essential to the meaning of the sentence. If we're going to understand what the author of this sentence is saying, we need those words. Therefore, it's wrong to put commas around Tom Hanks. It's really not an interrupting phrase. Instead, it's a phrase which is essential to understanding the meaning of the sentence. The right way to punctuate this sentence is without any commas at all. We spotted the actor Tom Hanks having lunch in a restaurant on Madison Avenue. Notice that when we read the sentence without pauses, the meaning is much more clear and it all hangs together logically. So knowing where to put the commas in sentences like these requires that you really think about the meaning of the sentence and how the various parts fit together so that the commas can accurately reflect the meaning of the sentence and help your reader to navigate appropriately. As we've seen, a comma represents a brief pause in a sentence. There are two other punctuation marks that are used to indicate pauses in sentences, which are a little more complicated than commas. These are semicolons and colons. Understanding how to use them is a little tricky, but once you know the rules, you'll never get them wrong, and people will consider you very smart and a good writer. Semicolons and colons actually look similar. The only difference is that the colon consists of two dots, whereas the semicolon consists of a dot over what looks like a comma. So that's the difference between a semicolon and a colon visually. They're also used quite differently. In this lesson, we'll give you the basic rules for when to use semicolons and when to use colons. First, use a semicolon to separate two independent clauses where no coordinating conjunction is used. Now, we saw before that when two independent clauses are used to make up a sentence and they are joined with a coordinating conjunction, such as and or but, a comma is also used as part of the structure. In some cases, you might choose to take two independent clauses and simply join them in a sentence because the ideas are closely linked. you might do that without using a coordinating conjunction. When that's the case, you have to use a semicolon in between the two independent clauses. If you fail to use a semicolon, you will have created a run-on sentence, which will be an error. Notice that this is by far the most common use of a semicolon. So what that means is, as a general rule, whatever appears on either side of a semicolon should be an independent clause. That is, it should be capable of standing alone as a sentence. So whenever you use a semicolon, pause and make sure that what appears on either side could stand alone as a sentence. That should be the case. If that's not the case, chances are you're using the semicolon incorrectly. Let's look at an example. Dogs aren't permitted at the hotel. Therefore, we'll put Rex in a kennel for a week. Here we have two independent clauses which have simply been joined without using a coordinating conjunction. So the semicolon that appears after the word hotel is correct. Look at what appears on either side of the semicolon. You'll see that each of those clauses could stand alone as a sentence. Dogs aren't permitted at the hotel. Could that stand alone as a sentence? Yes. Therefore, we'll put Rex in a kennel for a week. That too could stand alone as a sentence. So we have what could be two independent sentences. But because the ideas are so closely linked and they really belong together, the author has chosen to join them in a single sentence. And the semicolon as a way of separating the two independent clauses is correct. One more example. In his last years, Matisse gave up painting. His final works are paper cutouts and collages. Once again, we have two independent clauses, so the semicolon that appears after the word painting is correct. Let's look at what comes before the semicolon. In his last years, Matisse gave up painting. Could that stand alone as a sentence? It certainly could. What about what follows the semicolon? His final works are paper cutouts and collages. That too could stand alone as a sentence. So in this case, the semicolon has been used correctly. So remember, whenever you are linking two independent clauses without a coordinating conjunction, you need to use a semicolon between them. And a semicolon should basically only be used when what appears on either side could be a complete sentence standing alone. Now, there are a couple of minor exceptions as to the use of semicolons. That is, a couple of instances when semicolons could be used without separating independent clauses. Here's the most important one. Use a semicolon to separate items in a list when the items themselves contain commas. This is a tricky one, and it doesn't come up terribly often, but often enough so that you ought to know the rule. As we saw in our lesson about commas, items in a list should normally be separated by commas. But there are times when you are writing a list that contains a number of lengthy items, the items themselves being so lengthy and complex that they actually contain commas or pauses. If you string those together, the whole sentence can become very complicated and difficult to read. Therefore, to add another layer of separation between the items, it can be a good idea to use semicolons to separate the items. Otherwise, you can't tell where one item begins and the next one ends. Let's take a look at this example, and you'll see what I mean. Among the leading figures at the Constitutional Convention were Thomas Jefferson, a planter from Virginia, Alexander Hamilton, an aide to Washington during the Revolution, and James Madison, a legislator from Massachusetts. Now, this is a long and fairly complicated sentence, but the key to understanding it is to realize that it is built around a list of three different people: Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. And each of those three people is described using a phrase that is a kind of modifying or explanatory phrase, which, for clarity's sake, has been separated off by a comma. Well, what that means is that it's not immediately clear to the reader where each of the three items begins and ends. So the author of this sentence has wisely chosen to use semicolons to separate the items. That makes it clear that there are three items being listed here, even though there are commas within each of the items. So it's correctly punctuated this way: Thomas Jefferson, comma, a planter from Virginia, semicolon. That warns you that another item is about to begin. Alexander Hamilton, comma, an aide to Washington during the Revolution, semicolon. and James Madison, comma, a legislator from Massachusetts. So here's another useful place to insert semicolons when you're writing a list that contains lengthy items which themselves contain commas. In order to make it clearer where the items begin and end, separate them using semicolons. In this case, notice that the semicolons do not separate independent clauses. These are not groups of words that could stand alone as sentences. Most of the time, semicolons are used only for that purpose. But here is an exception which occasionally comes up and which you need to be aware of. Now let's turn to colons. Use a colon to indicate that what follows is equivalent to what precedes the colon. In other words, a colon is used to introduce a group of words that restate or say in other words what you just said before the colon. What appears on either side of the colon, then, should be more or less equivalent or equal in meaning. Here's a tip for you. When used correctly, the colon can often be replaced with the words that is, or in other words. So you can test your use of a colon by asking yourself that question. Could I take away the colon and substitute the words that is, or in other words? If so, you are probably using the colon correctly. You don't use the colon, notice, to separate independent clauses. That's a job for the semicolon. Instead, the colon is introducing something which simply restates or says, in other words, what you just said. Here are a couple of examples. The silent movie era produced three comic geniuses: Charles Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Harold Lloyd. This is a good example of the correct use of a colon. We put the colon after the word geniuses, introducing that list of Charles Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Harold Lloyd. Notice that what appears on either side of the colon is more or less equivalent. We just mentioned three comic geniuses. Who were they? Charles Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Harold Lloyd. Those three names are equivalent to or equal to what was stated just before the colon, three comic geniuses. Let's try our tip, our test for using a colon correctly. Could we take away the colon and replace it with the words that is, or in other words? We could. The silent movie era produced three comic geniuses, that is, Charles Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Harold Lloyd. The sentence reads better with a colon, but it does make sense to substitute the words that is for the colon. So that's a signal that we're using the colon correctly. One more example. I drove all night for only one purpose, to ask Annalisa to marry me. Once again, the colon is separating two things that are more or less equivalent in meaning. One purpose. What was that one purpose? To ask Annalisa to marry me. Those two things are the same. The purpose was the asking. The two things are equivalent. If we took out the colon and substituted the words that is, would it make sense? It would. I drove all night for only one purpose, that is, to ask Annalisa to marry me. So once again, we can see that we're using the colon correctly. Remember that the semicolon separates independent clauses. That's not the case with the colon. Instead, the test for using a colon correctly is whether the things on either side are basically equivalent or the same in meaning. If so, then a colon is correct. One last tip. Don't use a colon to separate words that clearly belong together, such as a verb and its object, or a preposition and its object. People know that a colon is used to introduce things, and so sometimes they get carried away and use colons where they actually interrupt the flow of the sentence and aren't really needed. Here are a couple of examples of incorrect uses of the colon, which you ought to avoid. Leanna gave her mother, colon, a scarf from Mexico. Here, the writer knows that a colon can be used sometimes to introduce something which is going to be described, and so he or she has put a colon after the word mother. But if you look closely, you see that the colon is really separating things that belong together. It's separating the verb gave from its direct object, scarf. The scarf is what Leanna gave. So it really makes sense for the sentence to simply flow rather than putting the colon in. And the colon, in any case, could not be removed and substituted for the words that is. And what appears on either side of the colon is not equivalent. The mother and the scarf from Mexico are not equivalent. So for all those reasons, inserting a colon in this sentence is incorrect. And one more example. The new security plan was developed by, the local police commissioner and the State Department of Safety. Once again, the colon has been used here as a kind of an introductory punctuation mark, and we've seen that colons can be used to introduce lists, as, for example, in the sentence we looked at previously, where the colon introduced the list Charles Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Harold Lloyd. So the person who wrote this sentence is thinking, well, I have a kind of a list here, the local police commissioner and the State Department of Safety. So why not put a colon in front of it? Well, the reason is that the colon, in this case, is separating the preposition by from the object of the preposition. The plan was developed by whom? By the police commissioner, State Department of Safety. So the objects of the preposition come right after the colon. The colon, therefore, interrupts or breaks the flow of the preposition and its objects. And once again, what follows and precedes the colon are not equivalent. The new security plan was developed by is not equivalent to police commissioner, Department of Safety. So for all those reasons, the use of a colon in this instance is wrong. So remember our basic rule, the colon should introduce things that are equivalent to what precedes the colon, and you should be able to substitute the words "that is" for the colon and have the sentence still make basically the same sense and the same meaning. If that's not the case, then you're using the colon inappropriately. Okay, those are the basic rules for using the semicolon and the colon correctly. Try your hand at the exercise and see whether you've mastered those rules. When you're done, come back and we'll take a look at those questions together. Now, in some of these sentences, colons or semicolons may appear, and when they appear, they may or may not be used correctly. In other instances, semicolons or colons ought to be inserted. So your job is to read each sentence and figure out what ought to be done about semicolons and colons. Let's look at the first example. To this day, millions of opera lovers consider one man the greatest singer of all time, Enrico Caruso, the renowned Italian tenor. Now, there are no semicolons or colons in this sentence. Do you think either one should be inserted somewhere? What about a semicolon? Remember that a semicolon would normally be used when you have two or more independent clauses joined without a coordinating conjunction. Could this sentence be broken down into two parts that could each stand alone as a sentence? No, not really. There's only one clause here. Opera lovers consider is the subject and the verb, and there's really only one independent clause, and therefore a semicolon wouldn't really be appropriate. But there is a place where a colon ought to be used, and that would be after the expression, the greatest singer of all time, colon, because what follows is equivalent to or a restatement of what comes before. The greatest singer of all time is who? Enrico Caruso, the renowned Italian tenor. So what comes before and after the punctuation mark there is basically equivalent in meaning. So a colon would be the appropriate punctuation mark to use. Notice that we could also use the words "that is" instead, and the sentence would mean very much the same thing. That's a good test as to whether a colon is appropriate or not. So to correct this sentence, after the word time, use a colon rather than a comma. Next example. If you see a parking spot on the street, put your car there. Otherwise, use a parking lot. Now, this sentence, again, doesn't contain any semicolon or colon. Does it need one? The answer is yes. In fact, as written, the sentence is actually an error. It's a run-on sentence. Let's break it down and see how that works. The sentence begins with a dependent clause or a subordinate clause, a clause that cannot stand alone as a sentence. If you see a parking spot on the street, it has the subject you, the verb see, and it begins with the subordinating conjunction if, which means that it can't stand alone as a sentence. What follows then is an independent clause, one that could stand alone as a sentence. Put your car there. Here the verb is put, the unspoken subject is you. It's telling you to do something, and it could stand alone as a sentence. Put your car there. And what follows is yet another independent clause, which could also stand alone as a sentence. Otherwise, use a parking lot. So we have a subordinate clause followed by two independent clauses, which are simply joined together without a coordinating conjunction or a semicolon. To be correct, we need a semicolon separating the two independent clauses. So the sentence would then read, if you see a parking spot on the street, comma, put your car there, semicolon. Otherwise, comma, use a parking lot. The semicolon is needed to separate the two independent clauses which are being joined together without a coordinating conjunction. What appears on either side of the semicolon should be able to stand alone as a sentence, and when you read the sentence that way, you can see that that in fact is the case. So insert the semicolon after the word there, and the sentence is now correct. Next example. Under relentless questioning by the teacher, Joanne finally admitted that, colon, she had copied part of her paper from a book in the school library. Now, is the colon being correctly used here? We've seen that colons often do introduce things, but what the colon should introduce is a restatement of what immediately precedes. In this case, what follows the colon is, she had copied part of her paper from a book in the school library. Is there anything that comes before the colon that's equivalent to that or means basically the same thing? Not really. So in this case, the colon is really separating things that belong together. It's not introducing a restatement. And if you apply the test of could it be deleted and replaced with the words that is, or in other words, you can see the sentence wouldn't really make sense. Joanne finally admitted that, that is, she had copied part of her paper. No, that really doesn't sound right. So in this case, the colon is wrong and should actually simply be deleted so that the flow of the sentence would not be interrupted. Joanne finally admitted that she had copied part of her paper. Now the sentence connects the things that logically belong together, and the unnecessary colon no longer interrupts the flow of the sentence. Next example. At first, Columbus thought his ships had landed in India, semicolon. For this reason, he called the native people he encountered Indians. Now, is this semicolon correct? Remember that a semicolon is normally used to separate two independent clauses. Are these independent clauses, each of which could stand alone as a sentence? Let's read them and see. At first, Columbus thought his ships had landed in India. Does that sound as though it could stand alone as a sentence? Indeed, it does. It has a subject and a verb. It's independent in meaning and could stand alone as a sentence. What about what follows the semicolon? For this reason, he called the native people he encountered Indians. This too could stand alone as a sentence. It's also an independent clause. So we have two independent clauses that have been stuck together. You need a semicolon between them to separate them. So in this case, the sentence needs no correction. It's perfectly right as originally written. The semicolon is correct and necessary. One more sentence. 4 cities are being considered to host the World Soccer Championships, semicolon. Madrid, Spain, Seoul, South Korea, Sydney, Australia, and Bogota, Colombia. Okay, the sentence is a little hard to read, isn't it? That should tell you right off the bat that there's something wrong with the punctuation. And actually, there are a couple of problems. First of all, let's look at the semicolon that appears after the word championships. Is that a correct use of the semicolon? Again, normally what appears on either side of the semicolon should be able to stand alone as a sentence. Let's check that out. What comes before the semicolon is 4 cities are being considered to host the World Soccer Championships. That could stand alone as a sentence, so that's fine. What follows the semicolon, however, is Madrid, Spain, Seoul, South Korea, Sydney, Australia, and Bogota, Colombia. Could that stand alone as a sentence? No, it's clearly just a list. So the semicolon is being incorrectly used here. What should be used instead of the semicolon? Well, here's a place where a colon could be used. We've seen that colons can be used to introduce lists, and what follows the colon is indeed a restatement of what comes before. What comes before the colon is the reference to 4 cities are being considered to host the World Soccer Championships. And what follows is a list of those 4 cities. You could indeed put in the words that is, or in other words, in place of a colon in that spot. So a colon should come after the word championships, not a semicolon. So that's the first change we need to make. Now, what about the list of cities themselves? You might have found this very confusing. It says that we're talking about 4 cities, but we've got a whole bunch of proper names here separated just by commas. Madrid, comma, Spain, comma, Seoul, comma, South Korea, comma, Sydney, comma, and so on. Now, if you didn't know anything about these names, you might think, well, what's going on here? It sounds like there are maybe 8 names being listed here, but there's supposed to be 4 cities. Madrid, Spain, Seoul, South Korea, Sydney. What's going on here? Well, if you know even a little bit about geography, you'll know that these are 4 cities that are being listed, in each case with the country where they're located. And you would normally list a city and a country with a comma in between them. So it's proper to describe the city of Madrid, Spain as being Madrid, comma, Spain. That's the city of Madrid in the country of Spain. So here we have 4 items in a list, each item containing a comma unto itself. So we have Madrid, comma, Spain, Seoul, comma, South Korea, Sydney, comma, Australia, and Bogota, comma, Colombia. Now, what do we do when we have items in a list, each of which contains a comma? For clarity's sake, this is the other instance where we would use a semicolon. We can separate the items in the list with semicolons just because the items themselves contain commas, and it's confusing if you only use commas. You can't tell then where one item begins and the next item ends. So the proper way to punctuate this list would be to use semicolons between the items, and that way it's easy to tell where each item starts. And the list would then read Madrid, comma, Spain, semicolon, Seoul, comma, South Korea, semicolon, Sydney, comma, Australia, semicolon, and Bogota, comma, Colombia. Now the list is clear, easy to understand, and we can tell where each of the 4 city names begins and ends. That's the other use of the semicolon, the exception to the rule that normally semicolons should only be used to separate independent clauses. Sometimes when you're writing something, you want to quote what someone else has said. This might happen, for example, in a short story or a diary where you're writing about an incident from life, either imagined or real, and you have characters who exchange dialogue, who talk to one another. It might also happen in an essay that you might be writing for a class at school where you want to quote what some other writer has said, or perhaps quote from a figure from history. In all of these cases, you need to use quotation marks to show where the words you are quoting begin and end. Here's the basic rule. Use quotation marks to set off the words in a direct quotation. Since the quotation marks have to indicate where the quoted words begin and end, quotation marks are always used in pairs, and they're sometimes referred to as opening and closing quotation marks, beginning and ending quotation marks. Any expression like that is equally clear and equally correct. The important thing to realize is that you always need both of the pairs of quotation marks. You need quotation mark at the beginning of the quotation and at the end, so it's very clear to the reader where the quotation begins and ends. Here's a simple example. "I have a dream," said Martin Luther King, Jr. The words that Martin Luther King, Jr. actually said were, "I have a dream." So to indicate which words those were, we put the opening quotation marks before I and the closing quotation marks after dream. You'll notice that we also have inserted a comma after the word dream, preceding the quotation marks. In a moment, we're going to look closely at the rules about that, but as a general practice, quotations are usually set off from the rest of the sentence with commas. There's no hard and fast rule about that, but that's what most writers do, and it's a safe rule for you to follow. The important thing at this point to remember is that the exact words of the quotation must be set off by a pair of quotation marks at the beginning and end of the quotation. Now, how exactly do you combine quotation marks with other punctuation marks? It can be a bit tricky. Here's the rule. Put periods and commas inside the closing quotation marks. Put other punctuation marks outside unless they themselves are part of the quotation. Before we go further, I should explain that the practice of putting periods and commas inside the closing quotation marks is what's done in the United States. In England and other countries where British practice is followed, the periods and commas often appear outside the closing quotation marks. But if you are writing and working in the United States, it's safe to put periods and commas inside the closing quotation marks, as we did a moment ago with our quotation from the famous speech of Martin Luther King, Jr. Notice that, however, other punctuation marks should be put outside the closing quotation marks unless they themselves are part of the quotation. This would apply, for example, to colons, semicolons, exclamation points, and question marks. And another rule to remember is don't double up on punctuation marks. That is, in and around quotations, you don't need or want to put both a period and a question mark, for example, which you might be tempted to do if there's a question mark within the quotation. Let's take a look at some examples that will help you sort out what could be a confusing set of rules. The first example reads as follows. Paula said, "I'll be back by dinner time." Notice the punctuation that we've used in this sentence. The words that Paula actually said were, "I'll be back by dinner time." So we have quotation marks around those words. We have the opening quotation mark before "I'll" and the closing one after "time." Fine. Now we also have a comma and a period. As we indicated a moment ago, you usually will set off the quotation with a comma from the rest of the sentence. So we have a comma after the word said. Paula said, comma, "I'll be back by dinner time," so that the words that Paula said are being separated from the rest of the sentence by a comma. Finally, since the sentence ends, we need some kind of end punctuation mark, and a period seems to be appropriate. So we have a period at the end of the sentence as well, and following the U.S. rule, we put the period inside the quotation mark. So the sentence is correctly punctuated. Paula said, comma, "I'll be back by dinner time," period, with the quotation marks around "I'll be back by dinner time." Now let's look at this next sentence for a slightly different problem. Then she asked, "What are you planning to cook?" Okay, Paula's exact words in this sentence are, "What are you planning to cook?" So the quotation marks surround those words. The opening quotation marks come before "what," and the closing or ending quotation marks come after "cook." Again, we have a comma separating the quotation from the rest of the sentence. Then she asked, comma, "What are you planning to cook?" Now, we have to have a question mark here, don't we? Because there is a question in this sentence. What are you planning to cook is an interrogative sentence, and therefore it needs a question. Now, where should that question mark go? Should it go before or after the closing quotation mark? Should it be part of the quotation or not? Well, if you think about what Paula is saying, her actual statement is itself the question. What are you planning to cook? She's asking a question, therefore the question mark belongs with the quotation. It's part of the quotation itself. So this sentence should be punctuated with the question mark inside the quotation marks, inside those closing marks. So the sentence correctly is punctuated. Then she asked, comma, opening quotation marks. What are you planning to cook? Question mark, closing quotation marks. So we've got the question mark inside the quotation marks because it's actually part of the quotation. It's what Paula actually said. Now for a third example, which has to be handled a little differently. Kevin answered, "I think I'll make beef stroganoff. At least that's what I think he said." Okay, here we have Kevin making a statement, and the author of this sentence goes on to make a separate statement, "At least that's what I think he said." So let's see how we should punctuate this. What are Kevin's actual words? "I think I'll make beef stroganoff." That's the actual quotation from Kevin. So the quotation marks should be around those words. The opening quotation marks will come before "I," and the closing quotation marks come after stroganoff. Once again, we have a comma separating the quotation from the rest of the sentence. Kevin answered, comma, and then the quotation appears. Now, after the quotation, we have a whole other clause. "At least that's what I think he said." That's not part of the quotation. The author of the sentence is saying that. And since we have two independent clauses here, what punctuation mark do we need to separate the two independent clauses? Well, as you know, you need a semicolon in that instance, because we have two independent clauses, each of which could stand alone as a sentence. One sentence could read, "Kevin answered, I think I'll make beef stroganoff." That could be a sentence by itself. You could also have a sentence that simply reads, "At least that's what I think he said." That could be a sentence by itself. Since we have two independent clauses simply stuck together, we need a semicolon between them. But now the question is, where does the semicolon go in relation to the quotation marks? Well, remember our rule. Other punctuation marks, other than commas and periods, go outside of the closing quotation marks unless they're part of the quotation. Is the semicolon part of what Kevin said, "I think I'll make beef stroganoff"? Not really. Kevin just made that statement, and there's no semicolon within that. He's not connecting it to some other statement. So the semicolon is really grammatically necessary as part of the larger structure, not as part of the quotation itself. Unlike the example we saw before where the question mark was part of what Paula said. So in this case, the semicolon is not actually part of the quotation, and it should go outside of the quotation marks. So the sentence would be correctly punctuated. Kevin answered, comma, open quotation marks, I think I'll make beef stroganoff, closing quotation marks, semicolon, at least that's what I think he said. So the rules can get a little tricky as to where the punctuation marks go in relation to the quotation marks. The key thing to remember is comma and period you can always put inside the closing quotation marks. Other punctuation marks, it all depends on whether the punctuation mark is actually part of the quotation or not. If it is, it goes inside the quotation marks, otherwise outside. And with practice, you'll find that the rule is not that difficult to understand and practice. Just think about these particular rules each time you write a sentence with a quotation in it, and in time you'll become comfortable with the rule. Now, quotation marks are also used in a couple of other specific circumstances, the most important of which is governed by the following rule. Use quotation marks to set off the titles of essays, poems, articles, stories, and chapters in books. Normally, quotation marks are used for the titles of shorter works. Most other titles, for example, the titles of full-length books, are either underlined if you are handwriting or typing your work, or printed in italics, which is the case in a printed book or when you're typing on a computer. So generally speaking, as a rule, the titles of longer works, such as full-length books, are underlined or printed in italics, while the titles of shorter units, such as essays, poems, articles, and stories, would be contained within quotation marks. And there are other rules for other types of literary or other works, and you'll have to refer to a grammar handbook for more specialized instances. But generally speaking, the titles of shorter works would be contained within quotation marks. For example, my favorite short story is Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. Here the title of the story is The Lottery, so the quotation marks appear around those words, the lottery. And once again, the sentence ends with a period, which, like all periods, goes inside the quotation mark. Use single quotation marks to set off the words in a quotation within a quotation. Normally, again, in American practice, the quotation marks that we use are double quotation marks. That is, you see the two little curlicues that make up the quotation mark. However, there is such a thing as a single quotation mark, which is used for a very specific purpose. It doesn't come up that often, but occasionally it does come up. Once in a while, within a quotation, there is a quotation. That is, within the quoted words, the person who is saying those quoted words is himself quoting someone else. When that's the case, you need somehow to set off that inner quotation from the larger outer quotation. And it would be a bit confusing if you simply used the same kind of quotation marks, because after a while people would become confused. Is this the quote within the quote, or is it just the larger quote? Therefore, the practice that has evolved over time is to use double quotation marks for normal quotations, and in the unusual circumstance where there is a quotation within a quotation, to use single quotation marks to set that off. Here's an example of how that might look. King declared, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Okay, we're returning again to the famous speech on civil rights by the great African-American leader, Martin Luther King. And in that speech, Martin Luther King did himself quote other famous words. In this particular quotation, Martin Luther King was quoting from the Declaration of Independence. The words from the Declaration of Independence that Martin Luther King was quoting were, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So this particular sentence is quoting Martin Luther King, who in turn was quoting another literary work. So here's how the quotation marks have to work. We put normal double quotation marks around all of King's words, starting with "I have a dream" and ending with the end of the sentence, that all men are created equal. Because all of that is what King said as he got up on the podium on that important historical day. All of that is what King said, so all of that is contained within the double quotation marks. But then within the quotation, where King was himself quoting the Declaration of Independence, we use the single quotation marks to set off those words and make it obvious to the reader where the quotation within the quotation begins and ends, which does mean that at the end of the sentence, the single and double quotation marks appear together. It's a little tricky, and you have to look closely to see what you're seeing, but that's the right way to do it. So the sentence is correctly punctuated this way: King declared, comma, opening double quotation marks, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, comma, opening single quotation marks. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, period, closing single quotation marks, closing double quotation marks." And that's the way the sentence should be constructed. Will this come up often in your writing? Not at all. But it will occasionally happen, and when you're reading, you'll see sentences written this way. So it's important to understand the rule, not only for your writing, but also so that when you're reading written works, you'll understand exactly how the quotation marks work. Finally, quotation marks are often misused. Don't use quotation marks for emphasis or to cast doubt. Here are a couple of examples of ways that you'll see quotation marks used, which are really not right. In one case, it's actually wrong, and in the other case, it's kind of a sloppy or lazy use of quotation marks. Our first example, which is strictly wrong, is sometimes you'll see signs in stores or other locations that read something like this: "Special today, quote, fresh corn on the cob." The author of this sentence is trying to emphasize the word fresh. He's trying to say, wow, it's really fresh. You really want this corn on the cob. But by putting the quotes around the word fresh, he's making it sound as though he is quoting some other source, that the word fresh comes from someone else, which doesn't really make sense. If the author of this sign wants to emphasize fresh, perhaps he could underline it or even print it in a different color. But quotation marks are really only used to mean these are words that I am borrowing from some other source. It doesn't really make sense to use them for emphasis, as people often carelessly do when they're writing things like signs. If you find them in your own papers, that's wrong. Correct that. And here's another example. If the English always seem grouchy, it's probably because of their country's, quote, beautiful weather. Sometimes people will use quotation marks this way in order to indicate a slightly different meaning, to say, well, I don't really believe that this is true. It's a way of casting doubt or making fun of what's being said. And sometimes, even in conversation, people will hold up their fingers and wiggle them to say, quote, as if to indicate that there's some doubt about what is being said. Like, oh yeah, that was a great concert. You see, it's a way of being sarcastic. But it's not a very clear or effective way of communicating the meaning. And so you should avoid using quotation marks in this way. It's a somewhat lazy way of trying to be sarcastic or ironic or cast some kind of doubt on what you're saying. In this case, it doesn't really work very well as a piece of writing, and the author would be better off simply straightforwardly saying what he's trying to say. If he's trying to say that English weather is always gloomy, drizzly, and chilly, he ought to say that rather than saying, quote, beautiful weather. The point would come across much more clearly that way. So avoid that careless and sloppy use of quotation marks. You do see it from time to time, but it's not really good writing. Okay, we have an exercise that will test your ability to use quotation marks correctly. Turn to your study guide, and when you finish the exercise, come back and we'll see how well you did. Now, in these sentences, quotation marks have been omitted, and we've also left out some of the punctuation marks that ought to be included. So you can have the fun of figuring out which punctuation marks belong here and where they ought to go in relation to the quotation marks. So let's go through each of these sentences and see how well you were able to figure that out. First, as Robert Frost remarked in his poem, Mending Wall, good fences make good neighbors. Now, there are actually two things in this sentence that need to be enclosed within quotation marks. There's the quotation itself, the words that come from the poem. The quotation is, "Good fences make good neighbors." So we want to put double quotation marks, normal quotation marks, around that entire sentence. So we'd have opening quotation marks before good and closing quotation marks after neighbors. In addition, the title of the poem, Mending Wall, should also be contained within quotation marks. Remember that titles of poems are one of the kinds of titles that would normally be enclosed within quotation marks. So we'd have quotation marks around Mending Wall. In addition, we do need to add a period at the end of the whole sentence because, after all, sentences need to end with some kind of punctuation mark, and a period would make sense. And the period would go inside the final closing quotation marks because that's what we do with periods. So the sentence would ultimately be correctly punctuated like this. As Robert Frost remarked in his poem, opening quotation marks, mending wall, comma, closing quotation marks, opening quotation marks, good fences make good neighbors, period, closing quotation marks. Let's look at our next example. What did Emerson mean when he wrote the words, "I hate quotations, tell me what you know"? Ralph Waldo Emerson was a famous 19th century writer, and it's ironic that one of the most famous quotations from his work is this statement about hating quotations, but that's the way it is. Now we have to figure out how we're going to punctuate this sentence, and doing so will prove to be a little bit tricky. First, let's figure out where the quotation is. That is, what are the words that Emerson actually said, which should be enclosed in quotation marks? Well, Emerson's words were, "I hate quotations, tell me what you know." So we want to put quotation marks around those sentences. So we will have opening quotation marks in front of I and closing quotation marks after the word know. Now, what about the closing punctuation for the entire sentence? What kind of sentence is this? Well, if you think about it, you can see that the sentence is an interrogative sentence. It's asking a question. What did Emerson mean when he wrote the words blah, blah, blah? What did he mean? It's asking a question. So we need to end the entire sentence with a question mark. So then we have to figure out, where does the question mark go in relation to the quotation marks? Does it go inside the quotation marks or outside them? Well, if we were dealing with a period or a comma, we would always put it inside the quotation marks. But remember, other punctuation marks go either inside or outside the quotation marks, depending on whether they are part of the quotation itself. Now, did Emerson's quotation contain a question mark? Was Emerson asking a question? I hate quotations, tell me what you know. No, that's a declarative sentence. He is not asking a question. So the question mark is not part of Emerson's quotation. Instead, it's part of the broader sentence. The author of this entire sentence is asking the question. So the question mark should go outside of the closing quotation marks, and the sentence would be correctly punctuated like this. What did Emerson mean when he wrote the words, comma, opening quotation marks, I hate quotations, period, tell me what you know, close quotation marks, question mark. The question mark ends the sentence and it goes outside of the quotation marks because it is not part of what Emerson said. Notice, too, that we followed the rule of not doubling up on punctuation marks. Emerson's statement, tell me what you know, is a declarative sentence. It would normally end with a period. However, we don't put in the period because then we'd be doubling up. We'd have a period, closing quotation marks, and then the question mark, and that would look a little weird. So we simply omit the period because we need the question mark instead. We don't double up and put the period as well. Next example. The company president asked all employees to look for ways to work more efficiently and therefore save money. Where do the quotation marks go in this sentence? Well, this is perhaps a trick question. There are no quotation marks in this sentence, and there shouldn't be any. Why? Well, remember what quotation marks are for. Quotation marks are used to set off the words in a direct quotation. That means that when you write a sentence that actually quotes the exact words used by someone else, you enclose those words in quotation marks. This sentence is not a direct quotation. Actually, it's an example of an indirect quotation. Here we are reporting what the company president said. The company president asked all employees to look for ways to work more efficiently and therefore save money. It is a report of something that was said. So in that sense, it's a quotation, but it's an indirect quotation because the exact words are not being reported. If they were, we would have a true quotation, a direct quotation, which would have to be enclosed in quotation marks. So, for example, suppose the sentence read something like this. The company president said, all employees should look for ways to work more efficiently and therefore save money. Now we would be quoting the exact words actually spoken by the company president, and we would enclose those in quotation marks. But as it is, this is not a direct quotation. It's an indirect quotation, and quotation marks are not used for that. So we put a period at the end of the sentence and move on to the next example. Churchill ended his stirring wartime speech with the words, "Let us therefore bear ourselves so that men will say, this was their finest hour." Okay, here's another slightly complicated example. And by the way, for purposes of this exercise, we've slightly shortened the actual quotation from Churchill. So if you ever look up the actual speech, you'll see the words are a little different. But we're organizing it this way just to make the exercise a little clearer and easier. What exactly did Churchill say? Well, the exact words used by Churchill were, "Let us therefore bear ourselves so that men will say, this was their finest hour." Okay, Churchill said that whole thing, so therefore all of those words should be enclosed in quotation marks. So we would have opening quotation marks before the word let and closing quotation marks after the word hour. However, we notice there's something else going on within this quotation. Churchill himself is quoting other words. He is quoting what men in the future might say about the people of today. And what might those men of the future say? They would look back on the people of Churchill's own historical time and say, this was their finest hour. So Churchill is imagining what the words of a future person might be and quoting them within his quotation. So we have here that unusual situation of a quotation within a quotation. So here is where single quotation marks need to be used, and we'll put the single quotation marks around the words, this was their finest hour. And we will also use a comma to separate that quotation from the broader quotation. And finally end the whole thing with a period inside all of the quotation marks, because that's where periods always go. So we've got a quotation within a quotation here, and that's why we'll use both double quotation marks for the bigger quote and single quotation marks for the smaller quote within a quote. The sentence as a whole then will be punctuated like this. Churchill ended his stirring wartime speech with the words, comma, opening double quotation marks. Let us therefore bear ourselves so that men will say, comma, opening single quotation marks, this was their finest hour. Period, closing single quotation marks, closing double quotation marks. You have to look closely to make sure you've set up all the layers of quotation marks correctly. But if you do, then the reader will be able to understand exactly what Churchill said and exactly where Churchill was quoting from the imagined speech of some future person. And therefore the entire structure of this rather complicated quotation will be clear. Final example. Everyone chuckled when Kevin quipped, "Why is it that the teacher only calls on me when I haven't done my homework?" Okay, we have a quotation here. What exactly did Kevin say? What are the words that should be within the quotation marks? Well, Kevin said, "Why is it that the teacher only calls on me when I haven't done my homework?" So we want quotation marks around all of that. So we will have opening quotation marks before the word why and closing quotation marks after the word homework. Now, we can also see that a question is involved here. The question is exactly what Kevin said. Kevin is asking a question. Kevin's own statement is an interrogative sentence. Why is it that the teacher only calls on me when I haven't done my homework? So we're going to need to end this sentence with a question mark to reflect the fact that Kevin is asking a question. But where does the question mark go? Well, remember that the question mark, like other punctuation marks other than period and comma, only goes within the quotation marks when it's actually a part of the quotation. And that is the case here. Kevin's actual quotation is itself a question, and therefore the question mark is part of the quotation. So here we will put the question mark inside the closing quotation marks because it's all part of what Kevin said. So the sentence should be correctly punctuated like this. Everyone chuckled when Kevin quipped, comma, opening quotation marks. Why is it that the teacher only calls on me when I haven't done my homework? Question mark, closing quotation marks. As you can see, knowing how and where to use quotation marks can be a little tricky, and combining them with other punctuation marks takes a little bit of practice. But follow the rules that we've given you in this lesson, keep working at it, and soon I think you'll find you can handle these without making any errors. The punctuation marks we've looked at so far, the period, the question mark, the exclamation point, the comma, the semicolon, the colon, and quotation marks, all of these are by far the most common and important punctuation marks. There are a few other marks, though, that you ought to know how to use, even though as a writer you're better off using them relatively infrequently. So the punctuation marks that we're going to talk about in this lesson are ones that, generally speaking, you should avoid using a lot. Some writers do use these punctuation marks heavily, and usually that has a bad effect on style. Nonetheless, it's important to know about them, and we'll cover them briefly in this lesson. First, parentheses. Parentheses, like quotation marks, always have to be used in pairs. They're those little curved symbols, and parentheses are used to set off words or phrases that interrupt the meaning of a sentence. Now, we've already seen that pairs of commas can be used to set off words that interrupt the meaning of a sentence. Parentheses would mark a stronger interruption. The words within parentheses should truly be relatively unimportant or non-essential for the meaning of the sentence, and almost words that the reader could ignore and still capture the gist of the meaning of the sentence. So only use parentheses when you want to insert some additional words or an additional fact or idea that's relatively unimportant, but you just want to kind of toss it in to the sentence. Here are a couple of examples of how parentheses could be used. Everyone in Los Angeles, at least everyone I know, seems to be writing a screenplay. Here the point of the sentence is that everyone seems to be writing a screenplay, and the author just briefly interrupts himself or herself to say, well, everyone I know is included. Maybe it's not true of everyone. It's not a terribly important aside. It's a little idea that's just being kind of thrown in to add a little bit of color to the sentence. Not very important, and that's why putting it within parentheses is probably appropriate. Another example. John Lennon, 1942 to 1980, was a member of the Beatles, the most famous group in the history of pop music. Okay, the author wants to give you a basic piece of information about John Lennon, and while he's at it, he thinks, well, I might as well throw in John Lennon's birth and death dates. That might be useful to the reader. And rather than write a whole separate clause or sentence about that, I can easily insert those dates just by putting them within parentheses after the name John Lennon. And very often in encyclopedias or other reference works, you will see a parenthetical insertion used for just this purpose, to stick in an additional piece of information in a way that's unobtrusive and which the reader can ignore or look at if they're interested. So here's another good example of how parentheses can be used. Some people get into the habit of using parentheses a lot in their writing, and that's not too good because then sentences constantly feel like they're breaking apart and being interrupted. So avoid using parentheses a lot, but once in a while, for a statement that's truly an aside like this, you can use them. Another punctuation mark that's used for an abrupt break is a dash. Use a dash to indicate an abrupt break in the meaning of a sentence. A dash should feel like a more sudden and sharp break or interruption in the sentence than a comma, semicolon, or colon. In fact, when you use a dash, you should really only use it when there's a sudden change in the sentence, in its tone, its feeling, or in the meaning of the sentence. Here's an example. Someone had taken the file from the mayor's desk, but who? Notice how those last two words suddenly change the statement from being, oh, simply a statement of a fact that someone had taken the file, to suddenly turning the sentence into a kind of a mystery. Who had taken it? There's almost a sudden air of danger or urgency added by those last couple of words. This is the kind of sentence that you might read in a mystery story where the author is introducing one of the important clues that will lead to the criminal. So in order to set up that tone of a sudden shift from a rather straightforward statement of fact into an atmosphere of mystery or danger, the dash has been used. And that's an example of how a dash indicates an abrupt break in the meaning of a sentence. Now, sometimes authors use pairs of dashes to surround interrupting material. As we've already seen, both pairs of commas and parentheses can be used to surround interrupting material. When you use dashes to do it, again, it feels a little bit more abrupt, and it's somewhat more informal in feeling. So if you were writing something rather informal, such as a story, for example, or a letter to a friend, using dashes can work perfectly well in this context. But for writing a paper for school, for example, or a report for work, you might prefer to use either commas or parentheses. But here's an example of how dashes could be used in pairs to set off material that interrupts the main flow of the sentence. Parker claimed, with some justification, that his enemies were being hypocritical. Here, the sentence mainly flows this way. Parker claimed that his enemies were being hypocritical. The author wants to throw in the additional fact that there was some justification for what Parker was claiming. And so he's done it as a parenthetical or interrupting phrase, and in this case he has chosen to use dashes to separate the interrupting phrase from the rest of the sentence. It's perfectly correct. You could either use commas or parentheses, and those would be equally correct in this particular sentence. As I say, the dashes would have a somewhat more informal feeling. If you do use dashes in this way, remember you have to have a dash both before and after the interrupting material. If you use it only in one place, you'll be making an error. The last punctuation mark we are going to tell you about is what's called ellipses. In a different program in this series, we talked about ellipsis meaning the omission of one or more words from a repeated phrase or clause. Ellipses, which is spelled ES at the end, is a little different. Ellipses also has to do with omissions, and the punctuation mark known as ellipses consists of 3 periods. Sometimes people refer to it as ... I have never figured out why in this particular context a period is referred to as a dot, but that's in fact what ellipses are, is 3 periods. If you're typing ellipses, you would space them out, so it would be period, space, period, space, period, space. Ellipses are used to indicate words omitted from a quotation or to signal the trailing off of the end of a sentence. Here are examples of each of these 2 uses of ellipses. First, as Lincoln once remarked, you can fool all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. Now here we have a quotation enclosed within quotation marks, but Lincoln's actual words were more extensive than this. The actual quotation from Lincoln is, you can fool all of the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. For whatever reason, the author of this sentence doesn't want to include all of Lincoln's words, but only some of them. So to indicate the words that have been left out, the author has put in ellipses, 3 periods in a row, which indicate to the reader, here are some words omitted that Lincoln actually said, but which I am choosing to leave out. It's a form of intellectual honesty, if you will. You are warning the reader, well, Lincoln said a little more than this. I'm leaving some of it out, so if you want to quote Lincoln later on, you'd better look up the whole quotation to get all the exact words. So from time to time, you may need to use ellipses for this purpose. For example, if you are writing a paper for school and you want to quote some other writer, you may not need or want to quote an entire sentence. And if that's the case, use ellipses to show where you're leaving words out. Now, occasionally writers also use ellipses, as I've said, to signal the trailing off of the end of a sentence. in which case they use ellipses as end punctuation and create a sentence that looks something like this. The house is dark. I wonder why. And we have the 3 periods at the end, indicating that the speaker or the writer of this sentence, that their thoughts are kind of trailing off. And I guess the idea is to create a sense of uncertainty or mystery, and the way I read the sentence, of course, was designed to indicate that kind of mood. Once in a great while, using ellipses to end a sentence this way could be appropriate. But again, some people get into the habit of using ellipses continually in their writing as a way of ending sentences, and it gives the feeling that they're a little too lazy to figure out exactly how they want to end the sentence. Do they want to end it with a period, a question mark, an exclamation point? What's the link between one sentence and the next? It creates somewhat of a vague feeling, almost as though there's fog creeping in between the sentences. So use this very sparingly. Once in a while, in an appropriate context where you really want to suggest that the sentence is drifting to an end rather than coming to a complete halt, you could use ellipses to end a sentence. But don't do it too often. It's not the greatest form of writing. So these last 3 forms of punctuation are used a little less often than any of the other punctuation marks that we've talked about in this program, and they have less hard and fast rules about how they're used. But sprinkled here and there occasionally in your writing, they can serve a perfectly good function, and so it's important to know how and when to use them. Parentheses, the dash, and ellipses. We've provided an exercise that will test your use of parentheses and the dash, not ellipses, because the unusual way in which ellipses are used to indicate omissions from quotations, it's kind of hard to create an exercise to test that, since you'd have to omit words from quotation. So we focused on parentheses and dashes in this exercise. Try your hand at the exercise and come back and we'll look at the questions together. In this exercise, we've given you some sentences where either parentheses or dashes could be used, and we've even suggested at the end of the sentence which might be appropriate. And in fact, because these punctuation marks are used without very hard and fast rules, you could actually interchange them to some extent. So we've told you which one we think you might want to use in a particular sentence, and your job is just to figure out how and where to use them. Let's look at our first example. Because the following day, Wednesday, was the 1st of June, Loretta's rent payment was due. We've suggested using parentheses in this sentence. Now, parentheses would be used to set off a word or phrase that interrupts the meaning of the sentence. Which word or phrase does that here? Well, in this case, the word Wednesday gives a little additional information. It tells you specifically what the following day was, and might make the story a little easier for someone to understand or to follow. But that would be appropriate to enclose in parentheses. So the best use of parentheses in this sentence would be, because the following day, open parentheses, Wednesday, end parentheses, was the 1st of June, Loretta's rent payment was due. Next example. Napoleon's exile to the island of Elba marked the end of his career, or so it seemed. And we've recommended that you insert a dash or dashes somewhere into the sentence. Now, a dash, remember, is used to signal an abrupt break in the meaning of the sentence. Is there an abrupt break anywhere here? Well, yes. The last 4 words of the sentence take a very different tack from the remaining part of the sentence. Up to that point in the sentence, we're being told that Napoleon's career was over. But the last 4 words tell us, something different is going to happen, or so it seemed. When we read those 4 words, we realize that the sentences that follow are going to tell us about how Napoleon actually started his career again after being exiled to Elba. So there is a sudden break in meaning there, and that's where we would insert the dash. So the sentence could now read, Napoleon's exile to the island of Elba marked the end of his career, dash, or so it seemed. The dash alerts the reader, aha, a sudden unexpected change is happening. Next example. The Battle of Bull Run, known in the South as First Manassas, was the first major encounter of the Civil War. And we've suggested that you use parentheses somewhere in this sentence. Well, this is a good example of another way that parentheses can be used to give some additional information about a fact that's mentioned in the sentence, and to do it in a way that's not obtrusive, but which, if the reader finds it useful or helpful, then fine, the reader knows where that information appears. In this case, the words known in the South as First Manassas ought to be enclosed in parentheses. You can see why. The battle is mainly known as the Battle of Bull Run, but within a certain part of the United States it has a different name. If this sentence is being read by someone who happens to be from Georgia, let's say, in school they might have learned the name First Manassas, and so having it in parentheses for them would help clarify for them exactly which battle is being described. Most readers, however, will probably ignore the parenthetical phrase or skim over it in their reading, and that's why putting it in parentheses is useful. It sets this particular information aside as not very important, but it's nice to have in case the reader wants it. So the sentence would then read, the Battle of Bull Run, open parentheses, known in the South as First Manassas, close parentheses, was the first major encounter of the Civil War. Next sentence. When we compare today's automobiles to those of a century ago, we can see that much has changed. In fact, practically everything has changed. And we want to see you insert a dash into this sentence. Now, where is there an abrupt or sudden break in the meaning of the sentence? Well, it comes between the word changed and the phrase in fact. The sentence there suddenly shifts from saying that a lot of things have changed to saying actually everything has changed. It's almost as though the speaker of the sentence or the writer of the sentence is interrupting his own thinking to say, much has changed? What am I saying? Everything has changed. It's like they're correcting themselves in midstream. So putting the dash there indicates the break in meaning, and the sentence would then read, when we compare today's automobiles to those of a century ago, we can see that much has changed, dash. In fact, practically everything has changed. Another good example of the use of the dash. And our last sentence. In a later section of the book, chapters 4 through 6, the author describes in detail the early struggles of the American labor movement. And you're asked to pick certain words and enclose them within parentheses. Which are the words that interrupt the main flow of the sentence, but give a little additional or extra information that might be helpful? In this case, the interrupting words are chapters 4 through 6, so we would enclose those in parentheses. Once again, the reader can ignore those words if he or she chooses, but in case the reader wants to look up that later section of the book, the chapter reference is there, and it makes it easy to find it. So the sentence would read, in a later section of the book, open parentheses, chapters 4 through 6, close parentheses, the author describes in detail the early struggles of the American labor movement. So one good way of using parentheses is to get a reference like that in. You can even use parentheses, for example, to enclose a page number within a paper that you might be writing for school. So if you're quoting a particular work, you can put the page number in parentheses to make it easy for the teacher to look up that quotation in the book if he or she wants to do so. And it does that in a rather unobtrusive way without taking away too much attention from the main flow of the sentence. A good use of parentheses. Earlier in this program, I suggested that punctuation marks could be thought of as being like traffic signs. They tell you where to slow down, where to come to a complete stop, and where to change direction. That's a good comparison, but here's another one. You could also think of punctuation marks as being like the symbols that composers use when they write music. Symbols such as rests, or the symbols that indicate an increased volume or decreased volume, speeding up or slowing down. The punctuation marks tell the reader exactly how to read the sentences and the paragraphs that you write. They tell the reader which points need greater emphasis, which ideas belong together, which ideas should be separated, and when there's an abrupt change in the meaning. If you use punctuation marks skillfully, they can make your writing much easier to understand and enable your readers to follow your thinking just as efficiently as a trained musician or a trained singer can follow the instructions given by the composer for performing a piece of music in a way that really embodies what the composer originally had in mind. So learn the proper ways of using punctuation marks, and you'll find that your writing will be much easier to understand and much more effective at getting across your meaning in a powerful way. I hope you've enjoyed watching this program, and I'll look for you in other programs in Video Aided Instruction's English Grammar Series. Thanks for watching.